All right, good afternoon and สวัสดีวันสงกรานต์นะครับ everyone. Welcome to the PA Economic Seminar, and today marks our fourth seminar of the year already. And we are honored to have Professor Antonio Cabrales as our distinguished guest today. He's going to present the paper called The Interactions of Social Norms About Climate Change, Science, Institutions, and Economics. But before I give him the stage, let me give you a brief introduction of the professor first. Antonio Cabrales has a PhD in economics from the University of California, San Diego, and a professor at the University Carlos III. He has been a professor at University College London and at Universitat Pompeu Fabra. Please pardon me if I pronounce incorrectly. This is Spanish, right? And he is Executive Vice President of the European Economic Association, Fellow of the Econometric Society, and former President of the Spanish Economic Association, and Prize King Rejom, the first of Economics 2021, and that's Catalan language. I learned a lot from him. He has worked in a wide range of topics like the game theory, the economics of networks, mechanism design, economics of education, and experimental and behavioral economics as well. So without further ado, let me give you the stage, and please give him a loud applause to welcome him.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So as I was saying this morning, before this trip, I knew two very smart Thai people. They were the only Thai people I knew. I know dozens of very smart Thai people. So I come out of here deciding that all Thai people are very smart, which shows maybe I'm not a good empiricist, but that's the observation I have. So thanks for inviting me. This is very nice to be here. And so the motivation for this talk is this is going to be a very modest and humble paper, so we're not trying to do very much. But I'm presenting this to lots of people in the hope that maybe their ideas here are useful for people that don't want to do like good research and like this one, and take this forward. So the main motivation is we want to understand how is it or why is it that the opinions of people about different things change over time. So in the paper, we give the examples, for example, of something that has happened recently here. So there's been a new law that allowing same-sex marriage in Thailand very recently. If you look at the statistics in the US, already 20 years ago, most people were against the idea of same-sex marriage. Now most people are in favor of it. Same thing with for example, the ideas about abortion in some countries, or the ideas about marijuana was illegal in many states in the U.S. Now it's illegal in many states in the U.S. It's legal. So opinions change, and what we try to understand is why is it that opinions change? How is it that opinions change? How is it that the interactions between different people lead to opinions changing, and in some cases very fast? That's particularly important for the topic that we're going to talk about today, which is climate change. So I think it's probably fair to say that the world is not doing enough about this topic. And I think part of the reason is many people think it's not important enough. And we're going to kind of document how much people think it matters, and what are the interactions between different sectors of the world and the economy. Since I'm in a central bank, central banks will play a role in here, and you'll see. And I think also when I arrive there, I will tell you some ideas I have about central banks that are not in this paper but might be relevant. By the way, I'm very happy to take questions at any time. This includes the people that are online. So if some voice wants to show up from heavens and start talking, then I'll respond to that as well. This is joint work with Manu Garcia, who is a PhD student in economics in Washington University, St. Louis. David Ramos is a law professor in my university, and Angel Sanchez is a math professor in my university. We all share some of these preoccupations about this topic. Okay, so this doesn't seem to be moving. All right, so now it's moving. Okay, good, thanks. So, I mean, as a little bit of motivation, so this is I mean, I'm old enough to remember this movie from 1965. So it's a movie about a family at the beginning of the Second World War. But what's more interesting about this is if you look at the landscape, these are snow-covered mountains. So this takes place someplace in Austria, in the Alps region surrounding Austria. I was giving a seminar there, I mean, in a conference there, giving a talk a couple of weeks ago. And you see that, and this is the same time of the year. I mean, this is relatively later because this is supposed to be the summer, but I was there at the beginning of the spring. And there was not snow even down here. There was only snow up to here. So there are many places where the changes that we are observing are tangible even right now. So I have a good friend who unfortunately passed away from a tiny country in the mountain of the Pyrenees in the north of Spain. It's called Andorra, the country. And I know the people in the government there because it's a tiny country, really. And so I was talking to them a couple of years ago, and they were telling me half of the economy is tourism for people going skiing. And they already know that 20 years from now, that part of the economy will be destroyed. So this is going to be something very serious for the world in relatively more or less, pressing, but for many people, this is going to be a problem. And yet, so this is another piece of motivation, which has to do with opinions. So John von Neumann is the person in, mathematics, physics genius, which he invented game theory in his spare time while he was building the atom bomb and all these things that John von Neumann did. So this is how clever he is. He invented the computer. In reputation, he would be the cleverest man in the 20th century. Well, in the 1950s, John von Neumann was obsessed he was obsessed with climate change, but not with warming climate change. He was worried with cooling climate change. And in fact, he proposed, one of the things that he was proposing, so I read this in his biography, is we should go to the poles and dye them in blue or black so that there was more absorption of heat from the atmosphere in the world to avoid the excessive cooling of the world. So we all make mistakes. Even the cleverest among us make mistakes. It's only somehow through interactions with others that things can potentially change and so on. So that's kind of another motivation of this. Just to finish, another little piece of motivation. I was reading these memoirs of this very important, again, Austrian writer, Stefan Zweig, who was living, he was born right around the end of the 19th century, lived until the mid of the 20th century, I mean, early 40s. And he was an Austrian Jew. And he tells the story of his youth and then his adolescence and how this progresses. So he said that when he was growing up, he and his peers were all obsessed with creating art, doing beautiful things. He lived at the last period of peace in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century. And everyone was thinking of doing beautiful things because they thought the world is fine, we're doing fine, everything's good. So we should just dedicate our lives to art because after all, that's what's important. Just, a couple of years later, First World War, then horror happens in the between the two wars, then the other war. And so it's a story that is like no one sees this coming and suddenly one catastrophe after another is happening. And that starts creating things. So so I think this is a powerful, I would say, remembrance that we really have to work on these problems before they are too large and we cannot avoid them, okay? And that's why we need to try to interpret this opinion, try to see if we move this opinion. Now, this is a very grand introduction for what I said is a very humble paper. So I'm going to do something much smaller. But just before that, let me give you the final piece of motivation. So the first thing there is a piece of news from 1912. So it's more than a century ago, from a provincial newspaper in Australia. So the Science News of not even the capital, but a provincial newspaper in Australia, the Rodney on Automatia Times, Science and Notes and News. In a provincial newspaper in literally the end of the world from where I look at, the furnaces of the world are now burning about 2 billion tons of coal a year. When this is burned, uniting it with oxygen, it adds about 7 billion tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere yearly. This tends to make the air more effective blanket for Earth and to raise its temperature. The effect will be considerable in a few centuries. Actually, not that long. Already in a century and a half, we're already experiencing this. So people knew this. I mean, not anyone, just a lowly science journalist in Australia, of course, scientists had already hypothesized and done work on the effect of carbon dioxide on climate change in the middle of the 19th century. So this is a really long time ago. So scientists knew this a very long time ago. And in fact, not only they knew this, but even economists, and we're going to see the role the economists play here. Huntington's economic historian, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, already in that time, more than a century ago, claimed that climate change partially explained the fall of Rome. So we knew climate change is happening. And even economists knew that climate change can be pretty bad for society. Okay, so what's happening here? That's the history I'm trying to figure out. So given all this background information I just gave in this lengthy introduction, why does it seem that climate change is not happening sufficiently quickly? And we hypothesize that evolution of social norms is a slow process, and the transmission between different social groups is also complicated. So clearly, there seems to be, and we'll document this more strongly, very separate kind of boxes, and people are in one box are not communicating enough with another box. So that's part of what we're trying to document here. For example, since we are in a central bank, Mark Carney is probably the governor of the Bank of England, was one of the most influential people to try to understand climate change from the point of view of a central bank. And he started doing this already almost 10 years ago. And he said, look, we central bankers have been trained to think about monetary policy and regulation. And that's something that the horizon is a couple of years. You're thinking not 30 years from now, but 2 years from now at best. Financial stability is a bit more forward-looking, but usually not more than a decade. So the problem is for climate change, you have to think half a century or more, or you're not going to do anything. So this requires that central bankers think differently from what they're going to. In particular, think that climate change is part of their problem. And that's not easy. If you've all you've ever done is, oh, there's this disturbance in the economy, this disturbance in the economy, do that, or there may be a company that is falling that might put banks in danger. And this is what you've all the time been doing. But you need to change the way of thinking. And that's sort of what we're trying to understand here. How is it that things change? Now, so that's, like I said, very ambitious, but what is it exactly that we do? So first, we're going to propose a network model that is very simple, and that the network model will allow you to try to provide a formal apparatus in which you can test the interactions between different sectors and of the economy and different people and so on. We'll do it at a fairly aggregate level, but there's no reason why you always have to do it at this very aggregate level. You can do it at a more disaggregate level and try to see how these things work. Because of the simple way that the model is constructed, the model's parameters can be estimated with a vector autoregression. And the data is going to be, I think, the more important contribution of the paper. The model is very simple. The estimation is also, but there is something interesting in here, which is we take indices of mention to climate change in several places, in media, newspapers in particular, general interest science journals, economics top 5, although we are making a more general thing in here, where we have more data in the new versions of the paper that will come out soon. Questions in the European Parliament and the European Central Bank presidential speeches. So all the governors of the central bank, their things go in public. What's nice in here is that there's a lot of public data that is available on many things, and that you can try to assess what are the trends of thinkings of people in different aspects. And because they're all public, they're relatively easy to study. And in fact, all of this analysis has been done with just one of our co-authors, Manu, in his spare time, because his dissertation is about something else. So imagine if I had a team of 5 people trying to trail tendencies of things in here, you could do very wonderful things with the same techniques and not much difficulty. We'll use GDP to see if that has something to do with the trends. Okay, so if you want to see the results, because I know that some people have holidays and maybe have to go leave relatively early, and especially those online that we cannot vigilate. So if you need to go, that's really the punchline. So as we already saw by the motivation, but we document now more strongly, natural scientists have been concerned with the problem since more than 30 years ago. Sadly, for our profession, academic economists are generally in concert even now, at least at the top levels that we'll show. Or at least at the last time we look at the data, which was the beginning of this year. Things are changing fast, but so far. The mainstream media and the European Parliament started worrying really at the turn of the century. And it's progressed and it's become more stronger. The European Central Bank increased their concern in very recent years. The Federal Reserve Board still doesn't seem to be very interested in this problem. We estimate the model's parameters with a VAR, and it seems like media and parliament somehow listen to one another in the sense that there's coefficients that somehow mean that they are related. Their mentions go up and down when the others are going up and down. We also find curiously strong interactions with GDP fluctuations, but only if we include data from 2020 onwards. Before 2020, nothing. So I think that in a sense, what this shows is that there's been a big impact of the pandemic crisis in our awareness of climate change as a problem. And so that's kind of important. And sadly for us, we cannot find, with the way we're modeling, influence of science on media or the parliament. So it seems like the box of scientists is kind of sufficiently separated with media and parliament. I don't know. Either we don't trust, or scientists don't do enough outreach, or something is wrong there. All right, so there are several strands of literature this is connected to. In the social norms, we know that humans are conditional cooperators, and that non-following needs to cooperators. So we're going to need kind of more social norms if we want to cooperate solving this social problem. Social norms have been used to solve social dilemmas, and there's documentation on this for a long time in general, but also for climate change. There's a lot of kind of studies on media and science policy and science communication of climate change. Part of it has to do with central banks. We construct the index based on a couple of papers. One is from Baker and Bloom and someone else, and the other is from Girelli et al., who are, I think, working for a central bank. So this index kind of index ideas have been used in central bank research a lot. And the theory is based on a paper of Ballester, Calbormengol, and Senu. All right, so how do we construct the index? So we're going to develop a climate change index with the universe of news in top European and United States newspapers using the words climate change. We also use global warming, doesn't seem to make a difference. In fact, now that I remember, we are constructing the same index in which we are increasing the number of newspapers from more countries. We're also using a list of words, because a comment we got in earlier versions of the paper when I was presenting is, well, maybe people use other words. So now we used a list of words from some environmental organization, words that have to do with climate change, and now we use a list of, I think it's 50 more than words, diagrams. So this in the language of large language models, these things are called diagrams. they're diagrams, bigrams, and trigrams. So we're using combinations of 1, 2, or 3 words that relate to a problem. And we're using all of those. And so we used to use only climate change and global warming. And for this version of the paper, that's what we do. But we are now constructing an index in which we're using up to 50, diagrams and trigrams. That's nothing major changes, luckily for us. So using the methodology of Baker, Bloom, and company, we standardize these mentions. So it's European and United States. Just to give you a sense, the data you will see now are from Spain, France, Germany, UK, and the US, and in all countries, and Italy. And in all countries that I'm mentioning, we have at least 2 big newspapers, in some cases 3. We're now expanding this. I think we're going to use some newspapers from Asia and Latin America, because we were concerned that they might be different in other places. This we haven't finished yet, the extension to the number of countries. The extension to the number of words we have done, but not to the number of countries. Okay, so for across these European papers and American papers by month, we standardize to the newspaper level series so that they have unit standard deviation from 1995 to 2021. And then we divide this average across the different nations. We divide by the mean and multiply by 100 for the same period to obtain the normalized series. So this is just a process of aggregation that these people devised. We're just copying it. I think the other paper we mentioned, the Girelli and company, they do something for that was more interesting for central bankers, because I don't remember which one was this, but this was one on crisis or something like this, and that's what they do. All right, so this is what we find. So for the newspapers, and we separate here Europe and the US, and you'll see that the correlation is pretty strong. If I remember correctly, the correlation with the longer list of words is something like 97%. So it's really very highly correlated once we even introduce more words. And you'll see that the correlation between the US and Europe is also fairly strong. You observe that there very little in the 90s, this is 0 and it goes up to 600, and it starts to be a peak here. The peaks, by the way, all tend to be around the United Nations summits, the COPs. Okay, so this is where I think all the peaks, this one, these 2 ones, this one, not all have similarly strong peaks, but many are related to this, which indicates, so I mean, I know that there are people who are somewhat skeptical about the importance of COPs and so on, but I mean, COPs attract attention, and they attract attention by the media, and you will see that media and the public policy makers are related. So in a sense, this seems to indicate that they might be less unimportant than people thought. Okay, so now in the more general index that I was talking about, these are all the words that we're incorporating, and the correlation is 95. It's 95 with the US and 99 with the UK index that we just showed you, and they are kind of very in perspective. So, all right. Now going back to the science journals, here we're using just Nature and Science. We've also done it with PNAS, so the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, and we used another, not many more, but we've used another science journals, but the picture is very similar. They were already much higher than what we find in here. This is in the tens and so on, and so this is 100, so this is much smaller. So but it's also, it went up, but it's fairly stable. So this is very different in perspective. They've always been interested. It's increased more in the last few years, but it hasn't changed very much. Okay, one thing that is important to note, given that I'm going to show you now the economist, or maybe let me talk about this when I show you the economist. So the natural scientists, they've been interested for a long time. Okay, so this is something I already mentioned. So scientific research on carbon dioxide. So this is from a book that is actually very interested. It's called Merchants of Doubt. And it's how industry in many different topics has used tactics to somehow delay public awareness. So we were discussing earlier what policies implications can have it here. These people already knew many years ago. So the first that did this, so these economic historians have detected this in the tobacco industry, used very, very strong tactics to basically persuade people that, or at least sow doubts in the mind of people that tobacco caused cancer. So for many years, they already knew that the science was on the side of it's a problem, but they used diverse tactics. Like, for example, one tactic they used to hide success is they told newspapers that there are two sides to this story. You've already given space to people that say that tobacco causes cancer. You now should give me space so that you do this. And in successive crises that then done this. When we tried to ban DDT, they did the same thing. When there was the ozone crisis and chlorofluorocarbons were forbidden, they did the same thing. They're doing the same thing with climate change. So they document very strongly how they construct a group of people that are kind of professional deniers of anything, that have political agendas to somehow destroy this. And they go to newspapers, says, you've already given space to people, to scientists who think that climate change is bad. Now you should give space to people to think that climate change is not really a problem. So they've done it. So scientists were already in a very strong consensus that this was a problem many years ago, but they didn't listen. Now, the book also has a part that is very interesting on the reaction of economists. So the President of the United States convened a panel with members of the National Academy of Sciences to create a report, so that the president had a couple of reports, in fact. And one used Tom Schelling, and then so it's probably the important one. So Tom Schelling and one of the things he was saying in the first report is, perhaps we don't need to worry so much about climate change. And Tom was a very good theorist, not a climate scientist or not an environmental economist, but the argument he gave, strikes me as very strange for someone that was a sophisticated game theorist, which is, look, it's true, climate change is coming, but climate change is not just warming one part of the planet, it's warming all the parts of the planet, which means that many places that were unlivable will now become livable. And so all, in quotations, that's my quotations, we have to do is just move people from places that will become unlivable to places that will become. So this means really we're going to send 400 million people of Bangladesh to Siberia, or, that was literally the logic that he was explaining there. It's true that maybe borders were a bit more porous in the 1960s, but I don't think as big as. So that was the reply. He also said, well, this is going to happen in the future. And he was using the other argument, which is discount rates are such that anything that happens 50 years from now, it's irrelevant from the point of view of today. So the two arguments that made some sense in economics and were written in there, and in fact, even though the natural scientists were saying we need to do something now, the president said, well, we have other problems, we'll wait. That's been. So, economists have reasons to believe, and this is, in a sense, explaining that economists, even nowadays, so this is for the last, since 1990, 2021, we've expanded the list, there's not a big change, using top 5 journals in economics, okay? And these are mentions to climate change and global warming. So global warming, yes, one, I guess, and then, climate change, next to nothing. We're expanding the list now. We're having 20 journals in the list, and we'll expand it more. Of course, if you go to environmental economics journals, you'll see that they talk about this. But in a sense, environmental economics journals typically are read by environmental economists. Now, if a problem is general interest, I would say that, I mean, can you think of something that is more general interest than this? I cannot think of anything that is more general interest than this. And yet there seems to be nothing in here compared to a lot of other things. So we said, okay, pick and choose, counter-cyclical. Okay, look, I don't know. I mean, if you think of Lucas, Lucas saying, you know, compare the cycle with growth. So cycle really is very unimportant compared to growth. And yet we pay a lot more attention to cycle to growth. I mean, climate change is considered at the same level, more or less, as the gold standard. So that gives you an idea of how bad this is. Hopefully this will change, maybe in 2 years from now. Now, we will want to understand it, but at this point, this is the situation. Of course, I mean, I've asked people what's going on and they say, and this is the relation with physics that I wanted to bring about a couple of minutes ago, which is, well, we know what's the solution. So economists tell you have a problem like climate change, you should just tax the hell out of carbon emissions and problem is solved. Right? People will react, incentive will go. So if we're not doing it, I don't know what's the reason, but certainly it's not that economics doesn't know what to do with it. Now, I find this defense a little bit strange because we know what are the solutions in principle, theory, for many problems, and we still talk about them. So, okay, what is the solution to inflation? Well, we have lower monetary base and that would solve the inflation problem. Do we really need to keep talking about I mean, if the logic is the same, for the same reason we shouldn't do kind of research on climate change. If we know the solution to inflation, and yet we keep talking to inflation. So we keep finding reasons to talk about inflation and not climate change. So why that is? So it's a little bit hard to understand. So the relation with physics is, actually physics is another field in which there seems to be not much interest. And when you talk to physicists, they say, well, there's, you know, all we need to know about climate change physically, we know what's the process, how it works, what it does. So the physical science of climate change cannot evolve much more. You can start thinking about, let's say, maybe engineering solution, but that goes to engineering journals, or what are the effects of climate change on species, and that goes to, that's why scientists are worried. But from the point of view of physicists, it seems like a very not physically interesting problem. I don't know. Okay, so we're not doing very well. So this is the quote I was telling you about Schelling. So White House Office, Science of Technology started asking us, climate change wouldn't produce new kinds of climate sharing, but would simply change the distribution of climatic zones. We could continue to burn fossil fuels and deal with the consequences. Okay, so this is, I mean, I've already told you this story, but I wanted to see, since I'm giving you the transparency so that you can re-quote if you want about this. I admire Tom Schelling for what he's done to game theory, but this kind of, in general, makes my opinion of him not so good. Even as an economist, because an economist should recognize that, you know, this potential solution of migration and adaptation is economically very hard. Of course, politically, but even economically very hard. So someone was telling me in a last conference where I was giving this talk, expert in development, that you probably know more about this. It says, you know, one problem with this is that the people that would need to migrate the most, which are the poorest of the poor in like Bangladesh or places like this, they don't have the mental and cognitive resources and so to move. So the people who need to move really can't move. So it's not like, you know, this Schelling is talking from the point of view of a sophisticated intellectual that has moved from one country to another many times. It's what's the big deal? I live now in the US, maybe I'll move to Canada. But no, the people who are going to be suffering may have more difficulty. Okay, so this is another thing. So this is the uncertainty aspect that I was talking about. Significant reduction, the modification or adaptation is likely to be more economical ways of adjusting. So uncertainty says probably we shouldn't do anything. Uncertainty and time discounting. Anyway, so enough about economists. Look at European Parliament. The trend is very similar to the news stories. So next to nothing until the beginning of the century, something happens around here. Most of these peaks, again, have to do with COPs, but something is happening around this. I'm going to do a statistical analysis now about these trends, but I really would like to know what happens. I mean, throw some more data at this period, both for parliament questions and for the people. I think this one over here, you see that there's a change happening from 2005 to 2010. Something is going on. It would be interesting to see what exactly happens here. So many people have given me hypotheses, and we may work on this in the future. Like the Al Gore had this movie called An Inconvenient Truth that happened at the time, and there are other movements that start happening at the time. So it would be interesting to go a bit more deeply into this, and that would be next steps in this research to try to figure out exactly what's going on at this period, what's moving, the opinions around. Okay. Yes. Yes.
Okay. Just to want to make sure, because like there's also evolution of the way people relate to climate change. Like at some point we were calling them like global warming. Now we're switching to climate change. Now we're switching to climate crisis. And now we are like in like the UN Secretariat, like I was like saying something like boiling or something, boiling world. So that one is already been taken into account in like the when you're scraping like
Yes. So let's see. This is why we did this. So we in the data that you're seeing here, it's only climate change and global warming both. In the new data that we are producing, we're scraping all these words that come from some kind of environmental website that contains a list of terms that relates to this. We can always add more, so that part is not difficult.
Yeah, and now like I noticed like some papers like they do associate climate change in the indirect way through like studies on like climate mitigation or adaptation. So that could be potentially like some other keywords that could be added as well if you are expanding your research.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the second point I also noticed was you mentioned that like around like that when there's like a COP meeting, there might be some spike in like the way that the news coverage.
Yeah.
Another thing that might be considered is like when around like when there's a major extreme event like taking place, that might be like some emergence like sort of discussion among people about like, oh, maybe it was like due to
That's
like
right.
climate change or some that might trigger like media to start talking about like these issues.
I don't remember when was Katrina. Maybe the Hurricane Katrina. It was early 2000s. It could be around this time as well. I don't remember exactly, but yes, extreme events is something we want to consider as part of the forum.
The reason I say that was like in the case of Thailand, we faced like a 100-year flood around the year 2011, and around that time there are a lot of like coverage both in the media and also like among the policymakers as well, like on these issues. But then after time has been going by, then the amount of like coverage also dropped over time as well.
Yeah.
And then like when there's a COP meeting, okay, if the prime minister is like visiting the UK to negotiate about like the climate mitigation target and things like that, then the coverage will start going up. So I do personally believe that like maybe like the occurrence of like major events, especially the extreme event that rarely occur, might have something to do with like the mentioning about like climate related like keywords in the media and also like in other outlets as well.
Yeah, it's very likely. This is one. I mean, certain extreme events is one of the things that we're proposing to do. So yeah, that's definitely in the agenda. Now, the mention that you were making to the COPs and so on is one problem, as you say, with extreme events is they don't happen that often. Although sadly they're happening more often than they used to. But that's why the COPs are so important, because COPs happen every year. So I think being able to come up, and now that we know that extreme events might be one of the circumstances, if one thinks of the policy implications is, well, every time there is one of these big events, then there's maybe a time when there's more sensitivity in the media, let's say, to this problem. And this is when we as scientists can go to the press and say, look, this is a problem, we need to do something about this. And I know you guys have a very good blog and write about these things. So it might not be a bad idea to, when something big happens, and this, by the way, is true not just for this problem, but for other problems as well. Try to time the release of your kind of public, facing things when there is an occasion like this. So in the time, so I've been blogging for 15 years now. My children tell me it's the wrong thing to do. Now you should do, podcast and go video or whatever. So probably you should do that too. But in any case, what we used to do during the Great Recession, where things were very bad in Spain, is we were in fact, writing things about, I don't know, pensions or things or whatever, before time, and we released them at the time when there was a major discussion in Parliament and so on. So now I mean, the people who were doing this, like Jesus Fernández Villaverde, Luis Garicano, myself, we're a bit more tired and we do less of this. But at the time, we were timing releases of information. So I think it's strategically important that the communication that we do with the public is timed in the correct way, so that when there's more interest in this. Also because the way the journalists operate is they start trusting someone, and then whenever there is a problem or something, they call that person. So I mean, I've written a little bit about education, not very much, but at the time when they called me, I had written next to nothing. But I was a public communicator of education research. Because I was collaborating with a foundation, not very different from your organization that was funded by the Bank of Spain, and they wanted, so I did some kind of reading on education. So journalists now know, oh, Antonio is a reliable person. He picks up the phone when I need it and he answers. And I think that's an important communication strategy. Keep a relationship open with the journalists so they know they can talk to you when they need an expert to tell them something about this. So I think that also shows up in the data here. Okay, so central banks. So this is the share of speeches containing from all central bankers in the European Central Bank system, containing the words climate change from 1997, when the ECB was created, until 2021. And you can see that essentially until 2019, there's barely nothing. There's a little bit of more sustained interest at the beginning, and then it starts growing up at that point. And we're comparing with taxes and inequality. And for example, taxes, the interest in taxes by the ECB has been very, flat. I mean, it's been a little bit, but flat. The interest in inequality starts a bit earlier. So central banks were not, at least the ECB, was not very interested in inequality. They started getting worried about this at least a bit earlier in the century. It was also a little bit late in some senses, because inequality had been growing in Europe from at least the 1980s, but well, at least they got into this. In the what is the FOMC? So that's the minutes of the government. I mean, the central bank, the U.S. central bank. Basically, there's two mentions from 1993 to 2020. So next to nothing. Okay. Let me give you the theories, and I'll explain you the indices. I can tell you a little bit the theory. So the theory is, as I said, extremely simple. So we construct a linear quadratic model of preferences of individuals. AI is an action that an individual takes. Here is how much I worry or how much I mention central banks central banks, how much I mention climate change in whatever the work I'm doing. And there's a benefit and there's a cost. So there's a quadratic cost of doing all this work and blog post or whatever. And there is a benefit. Now, the benefit depends on two things. One is my own private interest. So the B is a parameter that basically tells me what's my private interest in the topic. And then this coefficient is the lambda GIGJ is how much the mentions of others influence my interest in the topic. So if others mention, so the J is some other, so let's say this is the central bank and this is the news media, or this is the European Parliament and this is the news media. So this is how much I am somehow, it matters to me that others are talking about this. So if this number is positive and high, this means that the more mentions by the European Parliament, the more mentions if I'm the media. Okay? So that's the construction of the utility function, or let's say the news media outlet. So now, if the expectations of us, this is a game, so if these expectations of our others are going to do are basically a function of past mentions, so that's how I form expectations. I use the past mentions to talk about this. Then the best response, which is my number of mentions, is going to depend on this parameter. The constant basically reflects my own interest. So higher constant, higher interest, lower constant, lower interest. And then the coefficients that are going to relate to the lambda. So this is how much I am influenced by others. And this is my mentions, and this is mentions of others at time t+1, time t+1, and this depends on the other sectors. So literally, once you see it written this way, that's literally a vector autoregression. So this is my mentions as a functions of others mentions lagged. Literally, that's what a VAR is. If we make all these functions linear, of course, which is what they're going to do. Now, this is written for an individual. Now, individual actions can be aggregated, assuming that there's the lambda parameters are very common or reasonably common among the group, there's linearity and so on. So with sufficient assumptions, you can transform this behavioral model into a vector autoregression. So this somehow gives you an idea of what we're trying to do. Okay, so that's all the theory you're going to see. And then we're going to, with this, we can already write the model in section 4, then can be written with appropriate assumptions as a vector autoregression, where X is all the endogenous variables, and the pi is the mention of VAR coefficients, and then the subvector of shocks. So what are the variables in our case? So mentions to climate change in the media, so it's the climate change index on the media. X2 is the mentions in the European Parliament questions. 3 is mentions in science journals. 4 is the GDP for Euro area normalized. And then I'm going to show you the results. So in the writing of the results, I'm going to write ARX of YC, where X is going to be the lag, Y is the index of the variable whose effect we measure, and C is the index of the variable affected by it. And data is going to be quarterly. So let me summarize the results, and then I'm going to show you the table. So at 1 quarter, all variables are affected by their own lags. So what this means is basically there's a lot of inertia, which we knew. So there's inertia in the way that dimensions happen in all these sectors. At 1 quarter, Euro Parliament positively affects the media. So whatever happens in the media will be reported, whatever happens in the Euro Parliament will be reported by the media. At 2 quarters, the own effects, no own effects. So this means that probably there are no cycles in this. We also find something that I find a bit strange, which is a negative effect of Euro Parliament on media. So there was a positive at one quarter, a negative on the other quarter. So there's lots of interest, and then boom, it goes down. That seems to be what's going on here. There is also a reciprocal negative effect of media on Euro Parliament. At 3/4, oops, sorry. At 3/4, the only own effects are given by scientific journals and GDP. There's a negative of GDP on Euro Parliament. So that's a little bit curious, we thought. So a negative effect of GDP in Euro Parliament means that when GDP is low, the European Parliament has more questions about climate change. Now, this is the thing that I told you disappears if we don't take into account data after 2020, which probably means that 2020 has a really big shock in GDP and a really big increase in interest in climate change in the European Parliament. So it's probably the fact that this big crisis arose that made people, oh, pandemic is a big crisis. We need to worry about climate change with PB, another big crisis. So I think that is the reasoning that underlies this. 4/4, the only own effect is given by GDP, blah, blah, blah. So generally speaking, I think we find, and this we've done different specifications with different data, probably the lesson that emerges from all this analysis is that Parliament and media are interconnected. They react to one another. They listen to one another. They somehow are paying attention to what is going on. There's this interaction with GDP, which I think is connected to one specific event. Now, the model does not pick up science influence. And we're not, this is a modest paper, so we want to make very strong claims, but there are several possibilities. One is that there actually is an influence, but it's more subtle than a simple VAR can capture. There is a possibility that, in fact, what goes on there is that the influence is over the long term, and maybe not all the papers. Some papers are influencing, others are not. So there is a possibility that the model cannot capture well enough this influence. The other possibility is that we really, as a scientist, are not making enough effort to reach out to society. I mean, it's not necessarily in our self-interest. Some of us are excluded. I mean, I've been a blogger. I know that you guys do a lot of work of public outreach, but not everyone does the same. So the career incentives of most top scientists do not give much weight to public outreach in most places. So, I know that incredibly smart economists that write things that are incredibly interesting potentially for the general public. When I was running the blog, so I now only write, but at the time I was running it as well, I was asking them for, can you write a, 2-page article on your paper, which I think is very interesting. And even on their own paper, said, oof, I don't know, I'm very busy. I mean, very busy. I mean, their career incentives have nothing to do with public outreach. So in a sense, something that emerges as a potential policy lesson in here is, if I were a government, I would also give some kind of prize or some kind of reward for people or making even a duty. So as part of your duties, you teach, you do research, and you do public outreach. Everyone needs to show a portfolio every few years. I mean, I don't know how it works here, but in Spain, every 6 years, you have to present, or every 5 years, your teaching results, every 6 years, your research results. They could do something similar. Every 4 years, you have to show how you engage with the press, for example, or what you try to do to engage with the press. So that might be one lesson. Now, this is the same thing that I told you in words. So here you can see the one means 1 lakh. So this is our 1 lakh. 1, this is the variable that influences us in this influence. So this is the 1, 1, the 2, 2, the 3, 3, and the 4, 4. That's own influence. Other than that is the 2, 1. So this is the influence of media, so Parliament on media. So that's the influence that we pick up here. At 2 lakhs, you see this negative influence on media and Parliament that we talked about. And there's very little more. There's this influence that was GDP influenced by Parliament by GDP or GDP by Parliament. Very little else. And that's basically it, really. So in terms of the conclusion, we're like I said, this is a modest exercise. We're trying to put up a proof of concept. These are things that one can do. there's lots more things we can do. We've discussed some of them, but we need to do more on how opinion is changed. So, for example, talking about central banks, I was talking to a friend, and I said, well, maybe what we observe in central banks, this interest in the ECB, is the work of Mark Carney. Mark Carney becomes, and then you see that there is at least a correlation. And he said yes. And this friend of mine is a sociologist, so he talks a lot to people, and he does these methods of research that are more qualitative. And he said that there's another thing that was happening at the same time when we observed this increase in interest. So elections of 2016, Trump wins. It was already clear that this guy had zero interest on climate change, as he showed later. So some people apparently in the Bank of France who realized this was going to happen said, this is going to be a disaster. And I know, or they said, we know that this has not been a very strong preoccupation of central banks. We need to change this. And they created this thing called the Networks for the Greening of the Financial System. So that's basically an organization that basically coordinates the activities of the different banks in the European and European Central Bank system. And I think Bank of Canada is part of this as well. I don't know if the Federal Reserve, but other countries participate in this. And this is a forum where basically central bankers that are interested in this problem talk about this. And just the creation of this has meant a big change in how central bankers in general think about this problem. And this was influenced by just a bunch of people that reacted to a world event. And that's the kind of thing that would be kind of interesting to document. Because once you start doing this, then other things happen. So I know a friend of mine, when I was working in London, is this Spanish guy. I used to talk once in a while, expats, dinners, and so on. And he worked for HSBC. He works for HSBC. And he was telling me that 10 years ago, when he started, he was one of the first people that worked in a small office they had at HSBC, I think the largest bank in the world, that worried about climate change. And there were 3 people. It was him, another kind of junior person, and an admin help. He says that now he has 100 people working for him. Okay, so banks have realized once you observe that the central bankers are on top of this, even if they're not doing anything yet, this says, maybe I should worry about this, because if they start regulating, I need to be prepared. And the sooner I start doing it, the better. So now there's lots of people working on this, and they give all sorts of counsel to the bank on their investment portfolio and so on, and that's what they do. Okay, I stop here. We can do many more things, and like I said, this is a proof of concept, but I just wanted to make you aware of what we were doing. You've been extremely generous with your time and your kindness, and I saw this beautiful building that you have in here, and your beautiful country, and the smart people. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We have a question online. Let me read it for you. The question is about the stationarity of the data use. Given the data use are quarterly time series, did the authors conduct any unit root test to ascertain whether each series is stationary or not? If 2 or more series are non-stationary, there may exist the co-integration. In such cases, it is recommended to use a vector error correction model instead of a VAR model. Estimating of VAR or AR requires a stationary series.
Yes, I think with the exception of GDP, all the others seem to be stationary, so we're fine. And GDP, as you know, has a strange effect, so I don't think it's a very big deal. But when we write it, we need to report it. So thank you very much for the recommendation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, there's a question on site.
Hi, thank you. So I think first question first. So you were talking about the correlation of media and parliament. right? In terms of mentioning about climate change, how would you disaggregate the effect potentially from, we were talking about when there's a bad thing happen and suddenly everybody talked about climate change, and therefore when that happened, it doesn't seem like they follow each other. It's basically the event that trigger them all together to mention rather than them triggering each other.
We've done a couple of event analysis for a couple of important things. I think one was the Paris COP that decided something, and some other big event, which was it didn't make a big difference in the overall estimates. So I think it's, I think it's probably that they start talking and about this, and when we realize that, so it's mostly when Parliament realizes that media realizes that the Parliament is talking a lot about this, they start paying attention, and the other way around. When the politicians see, because these things occur at a lag of a quarter or so, when the politicians observe that there's a lot of questions about this in the media, they start paying a bit more attention about this for the political incentives that they have. I think most likely.
One way to try is to compare two states. Like one is the situation when there's no like big shocks, and see if there's still that correlation between the Parliament and the media. And then another one is when the shock occurs.
Yeah, I think it's a very good recommendation. We'll do something like this. Thank you.
There's another question, or not question, but like commenting. So one of the policy implications here is that if we want to accelerate the public awareness about climate change, so get key political figures to talk about it and the public will listen. And almost similarly, if we get celebrities to talk more about the climate change, then the public will surely sway. So please comment on this statement. Very good question from Dr. Varapong.
No, yes, I completely agree. I think that's one of my main conclusions here. It's for a politician to make a difference, one would need a politician that is sufficiently respected and that has sufficient initiative. So part of the problem is, at least from sadly my own countries, I see relatively few politicians that want to be original. It's somehow the system doesn't reward people that speak their minds freely and try to initiate new conversations and so on. So most politicians in Spain tend to be quite reactive, and but there are people who, over time, they gain the recognition of being somehow, statespeople. Like I'm thinking of someone like Angela Merkel in Germany had this status a while, like a referent and, in a sense, a moral leader. And when it's a politician that reaches this status of someone that can somehow lead by example and ask people to do things, that would be a good. But those are rare, and so one would need to locate them. Celebrities is a little bit easier. In fact, we were mentioning Al Gore earlier. So Al Gore might be a figure of this. Like, he was a candidate for president, was a vice president, candidate for president. He almost won. In fact, almost everyone, all the political scientists I talk say he really probably literally won or would have won. There's a recent paper talking about this voting things they did in Florida were probably wrong. And without these voting things in Florida, he would probably have won the election. So someone that people can listen to and have some trust is probably important in the communication of this. We did a small experiment. In fact, it's actually published now in a general interest journal, not in economics, in a public campaign. So people were in a meeting from a foundation. We were doing communication of climate change problem, and people had to donate some money that was given to them, and they could keep it for themselves or donate them. And it turned out that the most important, the thing that made most difference in terms of donations was the celebrity. So we offered them. So one group got a science message, another group got the placebo, and another group got a message from, I think it was Secretary General of UN Guterres, the Pope, and someone else. And they both had statements from the past about this problem. And people reacted more in terms of donations to the celebrities. So I think there is evidence to suggest that celebrity endorsement, if they have sufficient moral power, is probably a good way to go.
Okay. Any more questions? Is there any more question online? Please raise your hand. Okay.
So one observation about the relationship between GDP and you said parliament or the central bank.
No,
So
it was both, in fact, yes.
right. So does that have something to do with strategic communication of the central bank? Where, if the GDP is low, instead of trying to communicate a lot about how bad the economy is,
okay.
Speculation only.
Could very well be.
But you don't have enough observation to try to navigate.
It's yes. You only have one big shock and one change. So yeah.
Okay, so I think there's no more question. So please, thank you very much again for coming.
Thank you. This was a big pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.